Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. We're going to take a little trip down history lane with William Murchison. He has a new book about one of our founding fathers who's been a bit maligned, Reagan.
The Life of John Dickinson. He calls it The Cost of Liberty. And the cost was very high. Well, we'll explore that with him in some history and perhaps get some notions on how he feels about our liberties in this country today as while we're at it. So, we'll invite you to put an ear on the radio. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
I'm political analyst and man about town, Al Spry. So good to have you here, all our Tough TV viewers and listeners of Florida Roundtable on 80 stations across the state. And we are pleased to have you with us, and thank you very much for joining us. You can also watch us here on Tough TV in Orlando and Channel 38. You can get it over the air with an antenna. It's digital quality, so I trimmed everything, my nose hairs and everything. Also in select apartment complexes and mobile home parks. You can also get it on Channel 69 on the Summit Broadband Cable TV system. And if you can't receive it, just call Bright House up or DirecTV or Dish and say, I want my Tough TV.
Yeah. There you go. All right. Well, as always, it's good to share these quarters with you. As this, my goodness, this year rushing to a conclusion on us. But you've got a couple of things on your mind there that we want to talk about. So,
our own Alan Grayson, who we've had on the show a couple of times, I was surprised to see that he lost $18 million, according to this article, as part of a Ponzi scheme. That was run by a Virginia man named William Chapman, 44. He was just recently sentenced to 12 years in the federal can. He pled guilty to one count of wire fraud. But, of course, he was the founder of the Alexander Capital Markets, where the clients would give their stock holdings to him as collateral for loans. He then improperly sold the stocks, despite assuring customers they'd get back the full value of their holdings. But the unnamed official was named AG, but they found out it was Alan Grayson. Lost $18 million, Reagan.
Wow.
$18 million bucks.
That's not
This was back in 2007, and give credit where credit is due. You can't keep him down. He came back and ran, and now he's in the Congress.
Yeah. Wow.
I'll tell you what, so I don't feel so bad if I ever get caught with something like that. I mean, $18 billion lost to a dude, a smooth talker named William Chapman, huh?
Wow. Yeah. That's not pocket. That's not walking around change.
Quickly, also, Obama shakes the hands of Castro's brother, Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, I should say. Interesting sea change. We're going to call this one as a sea change in U.S.-Cuban policy. What do you think, Reagan?
Well, Jimmy Carter was on that trip with him, so and when it comes to foreign policy, I don't think it gets any worse than Jimmy Carter, so... a sea change, yeah. I just, despite the fact that I think John Kerry it didn't take him but about 2 weeks to do a better job than Hillary Clinton, the administration doesn't have a foreign policy. It's like we're out there with nothing. So it's not surprising that happened.
Well, Reagan, I am one of the people who say, and people disagree with me, I think it is time to moderate the embargo and all that it hasn't worked in over 50 years, 55 years, so it maybe behoove us to maybe rethink that. So, also, Ted Yoho, who's a representative of Florida.
Yeah. The Ocala area.
He decides to have a family firearm safety event this month, except he scheduled it on December 14th. That is the date of the Sandy Hook massacre. You think that these guys
somebody on the staff there should have
somehow you wouldn't miss something like that, being a politician and so forth. But not to make light of Sandy Hook, of course, but you got to just wonder about what Ted Yoho's thinking.
I don't know. Well, I know what we're thinking. It's interview time. We've got an old friend of the program going to join us today. He's been here before. William Murchison, Dallas Morning News. You may remember him from CBS TV from years ago when he did the point and counterpoint business. He's a great author, journalist, historian, and he will be joining us as the Florida Roundtable continues. We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, we are off to the Texas area, where we are joined by an old friend of the program, William Murchison. And Bill, it's been a number of years, but it's nice to have you back on the Florida Roundtable with us again, sir.
You know, it's good to be back in Florida in just about any mode after being slipping on the ice in Texas.
Yeah.
These last few days. It has not been fun.
For those of you who may not remember, Bill Murchison is a journalist, author, commentator. He specializes in historical and cultural subjects. A former editor of the Dallas Morning News. You have seen his writing in the Wall Street Journal, National Review, the Weekly Standard, American Spectator, Washington Times, lots of others. 5 years, Radford Distinguished Professor of Journalism at Baylor University. You've got degrees from Stanford and the University of Texas, and wow, and we could just go on, but we got lots that we want to talk to you about. And holiday time's closing in on us, and around this time of year, we like to take and set aside a show for some new historical work, and you've got a great one, a brand new book called "The Cost of Liberty: The Life of John Dickinson." Now, and we're going to get into that, but I guess the first question has to be, why this book and why now?
This is the challenge to explain to readers and potential readers why John Dickinson is important. I happen to think that John Dickinson, who was a founding father who belongs on the top shelf, along with Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, is underrated today at a time when I think his contributions to the welfare and the weal of the new United States are probably more deserving of attention than they have been for a very long time. John Dickinson from Pennsylvania was known as the penman of the American Revolution, and he wrote many eloquent pamphlets in defense of liberty against not just pamphlets, but addresses and petitions in defense of American liberties against British restrictions of those liberties. The reason that I think Dickinson is so important today is that we're living in an era when the fundamentals of liberty have become more elusive for Americans to understand and to talk about and to think about than they have been for a long time. We're engaged continuously in debate about what the federal government, what for that matter state governments ought to do for us, and what the price of their doing things for us ought to be. What liberties can they exact from us in return for certain favors? And we have moved a long way from the consideration that John Dickinson had in the 1770s, that liberty was the foundation of this country, of this burgeoning republic that he lived in on the eve of the Revolution and after the Revolution, and that the opposite of liberty was slavery, and that if liberty did not thrive and flourish in the new land, then it wasn't going to have much of a ride. And I think these are considerations that we need to take very much to heart today. And John Dickinson, in my understanding, is a man for today.
Well, now, one of your notions, as you put this book together, he's been portrayed on television, on Broadway. HBO did the miniseries about John Adams. 1776 was the Broadway production. And it's your notion that Dickinson was wrongly portrayed in those things for folks who saw those. Let's talk about that.
Well, he was, Reagan, and you know how the entertainment industry is. We all know about the entertainment industry. It needs to create conflict. It needs to excite the viewers, the listeners, the readers.
Needs to have a bad guy.
Need to have a bad guy. Well, they did not succeed in the musical 1776 and in the HBO series on John Adams. They didn't quite portray John Dickinson as King George III's man in the colonies, but they made him an obstacle to John Adams's design of proclaiming independence in July 1776. Dickinson resisted because in his mind and in his observation, the colonies simply were not ready. They were not united, and they had not taken enough steps toward acquiring and securing foreign help and aid. Therefore, Dickinson stood aside on July 2nd, 1776, when the vote for independence came down. And it wasn't that he didn't stand with the colonies. He tried to say to them, we need to do more than we have done at this point. And he went on during the Revolutionary period to make many, the Revolutionary and post-Revolutionary period, to make major contributions to American life and to American liberty. But the entertainment industry has seized this particular feature of his career and played it up in a way that gives one in the 21st century a very bad impression of Dickinson's actual importance in the roster of American heroes.
And I guess the reason why they zeroed in on him, so to speak, was his reluctance to sign the Declaration of Independence. What's the story behind that?
Well, Dickinson was a Quaker. It was not that. I'll tell you something interesting about that in just a moment. It was his Quakerism was not as I understand it, the motive for his resisting military combat with the British, but he lived in a Quaker colony that had Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, which had attained great prosperity, great happiness under British rule. He wanted, as a lawyer, to reconcile these contending parties, Britain on the one hand and the colonies on the other hand. He thought, we don't have to make this break. This is early on. Before the Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. But he thought, we can work this out. The British are taxing us without representation, but we can make them understand that is contrary to their legal their legal tradition, and that we, the colonies, are entitled to the same rights as Englishmen. He worked at this. He strived for it. He applied himself to it for years, and finally the hope of reconciliation faded. Here's what I wanted to say, Reagan, about the Quaker aspect of Dickinson's personality. When independence was voted for in Philadelphia on July 2nd, 1776, John Dickinson left to head up a company of Philadelphia militia and led them off to northern New Jersey, just opposite New York, just opposite Staten Island, where the British were landing, to resist British moves against New Jersey if those came. He was no coward. He was no wimp. He was no pacifist. He understood what had to be done, but he rarely gets credit for this either. And he actually served, but despite very bad health that he had most of his life, he served in uniform. Only one of two founding fathers to do so, not counting George Washington, of course. Only two members of the Continental Congress served in uniform against the British. One was Thomas McCain of Delaware. The other was John Dickinson of Pennsylvania.
And historically, his role in Pennsylvania and Delaware had been quite prominent through the years.
Yes. Yes. He regained in later years a lot of the reputation that he had lost with some of his countrymen when he declined to vote for independence. He went on to write actually just before the vote on independence, he wrote the first draft of the Articles of Confederation, which served as the governmental structure for the colonies during the Revolution and afterwards. He served as president. That was the title actually given in the 1780s after the Revolutionary War, President of Pennsylvania and President of Delaware, which were separate but closely related colonies. And he served with honor and distinction in both cases. He was one of the organizers of the Constitutional Convention that met in Philadelphia in May of 1787 and wrote the Constitution. He didn't sign the Constitution. I'll tell you why he didn't sign it. Because he had become so ill on account of his labors that he had to go home. He asked a friend to affix his name to the Constitution, and there it reposes to this day. Delaware, he was a representative, he was a delegate from Delaware, John Dickinson. And he wrote a series of pamphlets in behalf of the Constitution, pleading for ratification of the Constitution after the convention had been held. He had a long and distinguished career. His health probably prevented him from serving in the Senate. Delaware greatly desired him to serve as a senator from Delaware. He might have held office under Thomas Jefferson, who was a friend of his. Oddly enough, the declaration that Dickinson declined to sign was written by his friend Thomas Jefferson. But he went on, in spite of criticisms and objurgations that were hurled at him by the likes of John Adams, he continued to serve, to look for those ways in which he could assist the cause of independence and the cause of liberty in the new fledgling nation, and he succeeded nobly.
You hold out the possibility that had his health been better, it might very well have been John Dickinson that wrote the Declaration of Independence instead of Thomas Jefferson.
Well, it might have been. He might have written the Declaration of Independence had he had a different disposition about the need for independence at that time, and he would have probably put a natural law spin on it. Dickinson's argument was that rights derived from God, that they were guaranteed by government under obligation to God, who was the author of all our liberties. You know, in America, the line, "Our Father's God to thee, author of liberty," that would have been Dickinson's motif in the Declaration of Independence had he written it. He took Thomas Jefferson's handiwork as nevertheless definitive for the cause of the colonies. He extended his right hand to Jefferson symbolically and in many ways over the years, and Dickinson called him. Jefferson called him at the end one of the great worthies of the Revolution. There was very little distance between the two on this matter of the necessity for the colonists to take their English legacy of liberty and to step forth into the world and display those liberties to the world as symbols, as emblems of what the human race was capable of doing and affecting under the guidance and providence of God.
Mm-hmm. Bill, on that note, we need to take a little bit of a pause along the network line here. Let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and on Tough TV in the Orlando area. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is historian, author, journalist Bill Murchison. His new book, The Cost of Liberty, The Life of John Dickinson. And we'll continue our conversation following these messages. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area, we're also on Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And our very special guest this day is journalist, columnist, historian, author William Murchison. The Cost of Liberty, his brand new book, The Life of John Dickinson. And it's a marvelous book. Bill has taken the notion that John Dickinson is one of the underrated for all these years of the Founding Fathers. And he makes a marvelous case about why John Dickinson should be better remembered. So as we launch into this next segment here, Bill, I wanted to ask you to get into, you say that Dickinson was a fellow traveler of Thomas Jefferson. He had some health problems, but they were good friends. I want to hear about this philosophy that perhaps is somewhat getting lost in the 21st century here.
Well, Dickinson had a philosophy of liberty. His objection to the taxation that the British imposed upon the colonies at the end of the French and Indian War, for reasons that the British thought were sufficient, raising revenue and maintaining colonial defenses and against the Indians and that sort of thing. Dickinson's objection was that this was a violation of British tradition. The Parliament had to give its consent, and there had been long struggles in England over this very point. It was one of the causes of the English Civil War in the 17th century, and the overthrow of King Charles I. Parliament had to consent to taxation. Likewise, for the colonists to enjoy anything like authentic liberty, control of their own property, their property had to be secure against the exactions of government, except when those exactions were made by their duly elected representatives. In other words, taxation without representation, that old watchword, that old slogan, was a great deal more than a slogan. It was a central element in the English understanding of liberty. Now John Dickinson. Now I hadn't made this point before, and I think it's worth going into. John Dickinson had studied law in London. He was one of relatively few Americans, and certainly one of relatively few American lawyers who had gone to the source of British liberties. He studied at the Middle Temple in London and learned there the great traditions of British liberty and British law. And he saw these rights that the English enjoyed as pertaining to all Englishmen wherever they were. Now, you know, Reagan, it's certainly complicated from an administrative standpoint when you're trying to run an empire. You're in London, and you want your citizens, your fellow Englishmen across the sea, to do this, that, or the other, and they have no representation in Parliament because they're 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. It gets very complicated. I have a certain sympathy for the British, as I think Dickinson did. He said every drop of blood in my heart is British. And you can have sympathy with people who were trying to, I'm speaking of the people in London, who were trying to maintain English liberties in a context that restricted those liberties in the colonies for the sake of a tighter unity among Englishmen on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. But still, it was taxation without representation. The colonists weren't represented. And Dickinson saw this as slavery. He understood it in a pamphlet that he wrote in 1767 called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. It was written anonymously. He was a landowner. He was not simply a guy who went out at 6 o'clock in the morning and commenced to dig in the ground. He was a proprietor, but one tied very closely to the land, and he represented himself as a farmer. But the law, the understanding of law that he made plain in this series of pamphlets, 12 pamphlets, was that the colonists were entitled to the same liberties as Englishmen were. As the Englishmen, well, they were Englishmen, of course. Some Germans, some Swedes, but mainly Englishmen. They were entitled to the same liberties as those people living in London and Birmingham and Bristol. They had the same rights. And Dickinson saw the cause of English liberty itself as losing ground if Parliament felt itself entitled in particular circumstances to compromise its own understanding of what liberty was all about. If they could do this to the colonies, why couldn't they do this to their own people at home? There were implications that took hold not just in the colonies but in the mother country. He failed to make the English see this. The colonies, of course, he was not the only man, needless to say. The Stamp Act, passage of the Stamp Act in 1765 brought forth the Stamp Act to Congress that protested against this exaction, and then the duties the British subsequently laid on lead and tea and paint and paper were also objected to and protested by the colonies, and the first Continental Congress was the result of a whole pile of exactions the British made in their attempts to exert control over the colonies. But so Dickinson did not stand alone. He simply gave some of the most eloquent arguments that still resonate today in behalf of liberty over against tyranny. Tyranny was the last thing he expected of the British government. The British government was not tyrannical. The British government had a king, yes. The colonies had a king at the same time, and King George III was king of them all. But the colonies expected to be treated in the same way that the English were.
Well, but also King George was nuts too, and there was a need I think among some of the parliamentarians to control the colonies. That's where the turn from expressing liberty, like you had said, into more of a control thing, which of course rears its head as authoritarianism or tyranny. And I think that's kind of where the line was drawn there.
Yeah, George III was in his early years as king. He had come to the throne in 1760, and he wanted to be a good king. He was called the Patriot King. He wanted to love his people and his people to love him in return. And it was only in later years in the 19th century that he was seized with porphyria, this deterioration of the brain that caused the insanity that he's probably more famous for than anything else besides losing the colonies. But in any case, he was in his early years authoritarian, and one interesting point he made in the context of rejecting a petition. Rejecting the Olive Branch petition that John Dickinson wrote in 1775 in behalf of the Continental Congress. One argument that John Dickinson, that King George III made, was that the colonists were citizens of the freest nation in the world. they enjoyed rights and freedoms more than the people of any other country. But they were behaving in a manner objectionable to the need for a coherent empire. See, there was no understanding. There was no understanding on the king's part at this time of the freedom that a people living on the edge of the wilderness, making their way with their own hands and their own brains and their own exertions, and fighting Indians and making roads. There was no understanding in England of the understanding of freedom that these people would put together in their own lives. I'm afraid it just wasn't meant to be. Mm-hmm. If you look at it in objective terms.
On that note, we do need to take another pause along the network line here, but we can come back to that. But let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. If you're in the Orlando area, you can see us on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is historian, author, journalist William Murchison. His brand new book, The Cost of Liberty, The Life of John Dickinson. And our conversation continues following these messages. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, William Murchison, the author of The Cost of Liberty, The Life of John Dickinson. Bill has been writing long time in the Dallas area. You've seen his work in the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, all sorts of places. And The Life of John Dickinson, The Cost of Liberty, a 5-star effort. And Bill, let me say thank you for spending all this time with us today. We know how very busy you are, sir. So
it's been my pleasure, Reagan.
Well, I'd like to kind of tie this up and talk about liberty today, liberty under assault, of course, as we become more involved in a society that's focusing on entitlements, not what they can do for the United States, but what the government can do for them, the opposite of what Kennedy was talking about. And, it's not really all their fault, because you have to place blame on blame is a lot to go around. You have some companies who are not paying people enough wages where they have to go on government assistance, and in fact, some of the companies that they're working for are telling them how to get government assistance. You also have companies that are beholden to the government in forms of corporate welfare, not just individual social welfare. So where did we lose our way, and what do you think John Dickinson would be thinking right now?
Well, I think John Dickinson would be understanding the present conflicts as reflections of the basic concerns he had 240 or 50 years ago in terms of the rights of the citizen over against the government. Government, Dickinson understood as a contrivance for the preservation of liberty, and for the coordinated supply of services and obligations that citizens are not able to perform for themselves. But government, in the performing of services, has to be reminded continually. And Dickinson was one of those who sought to remind government. He sought to remind his own government, the British government, and the British government's officials in the colonies, that government did not exist for its own sake, that it existed to guarantee the liberties of the people. If government did not guarantee those liberties, but violated those liberties and transcended those liberties, then government was acting in a manner that made it contemptible in the eyes of the citizens, and that in the case of the American Revolution actually prompted its overthrow. Government can get out of hand. Government has always done this. That is to say, not every government in every place at every time, but government being the coordinated instrument of particular people can forget that it represents people.
Well, that's what Jefferson was talking about. Every 20 years there should be a revolution. You know,
he did. Yes, he should. The tree of liberty should be watered with the blood of patriots. He said, which is. You know, when you've lived as long as I have, Reagan, you got to gone through a lot of revolutions.
Well, exactly,
and
you want to know, that's the thing. The government. That's why they don't like some of the Tea Party folks, is because they read Jefferson and they don't want to get overthrown. But we're not talking about overthrowing. I think there's various ways of accomplishing this without a full scale revolution. But
unquestionably, and that's what Dickinson was trying to summon both the colonies and the British government to do, to stop right here, stop, think, look what's happening. Liberties are being taken away from the people. Taxation without representation is a deprivation of liberty. Stop right now. Let's understand what the stakes in this are. Unless taxes are levied by the representatives of the people, then the people are on the way to becoming slaves. So let's first form this understanding, and then let's work at how we can address the need for revenue within the context of the preservation of the people's liberties. Dickinson understood perfectly the stresses and the strains in the relationship in the 1770s and 1760s. I think he would have understood perfectly the stresses and the strains in the relationship between the federal government today and the people, who, on account of the Affordable Health Care Act and other acts stretching the power of the federal government, have become disaffected from government and want government to stop. Dickinson would say, stop, think, look what you're doing.
Well, government is they'll never stop on their own, and if the people are not paying attention, which it doesn't seem like many of them are, then there really is nothing to stop government.
Well, they were paying attention in the 1760s and 1770s.
It's a different group today, though, wouldn't you say? Not as well read, not as quite as astute, I think, and a larger group too. It's a lot more people. I'm not talking, of course, of the listeners and watchers of this show. We are in a unique category, if I may say. But you could say that there's some other folks out there that are too busy and distracted with their own personal existences and other things like that.
That's right, they are. But that's what elections are about, among other things, and the right of free speech, which is one of those basic English rights that Dickinson thought needed protection. That gives us the opportunity to speak to those people, to say what needs to be said to them. And I have to say, Reagan, that if we fail to do that, then we are in some sense the authors of our own downfall. That we have the opportunity as free American citizens, with the right of assembly, the right of free speech, as well as the right of worship, to muster the arguments that need to be heard, that need to be repeated, that need to be learned. And if we don't, then we need to look around and wonder if we're not obstacles to the recovery of our liberties.
I think perhaps that John Dickinson, there was a quote from Mark Twain. He said it frequently, but it doesn't get put out there very often. He liked to say that we are a people who have a government, not the other way around.
Yes.
And
yes, government does not have a people. Government exists because of the people. The people put government in place. That's what happened in Philadelphia in 1787. People came together, wrote a constitution. The people preceded the government. The government followed the people. What happened? How did the Constitution go into effect? The people put it into effect by ratifying it through the action of state legislatures.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Bill, we're going to have to leave it there, but it is always fascinating. I want to remind the folks, the book is The Cost of Liberty, The Life of John Dickinson by William Murchison. It is always a fabulous time to have you with us, sir, and your points and notions are well taken, well spoken, and we certainly hope that you will come back and do this with us again soon.
A great joy for me, Reagan, and Al, thank you very much for having me.
William Murchison. This is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And we'll be back with a brief closing thought following these messages. It's the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Always a pleasure to have William Murchison with us from Texas, The Cost of Liberty and the Life of John Dickinson. Just barely enough time for us to say thank you for listening and goodbye. I'm Reagan.
I'm Al.
And we'll see you again next week.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.